They called us the gentle giants of the galaxy. For 3 centuries, humanity had earned that title through diplomacy, trade agreements, and careful restraint. We were the species that chose negotiation over warfare, the ones who built hospitals on alien worlds and shared our technology freely. The Galactic Council praised our civilized nature and held us as an example to younger species. But they forgot something crucial about humans. We learned civility because we had to control what lay beneath it. The massacre of Colony 7 wasn't just an attack. It was a deliberate torture session broadcast across 17 star systems, designed to humiliate and break the human spirit. Children's screams echoed through subspace channels. Families were separated and tormented for hours before their deaths. The Zethkar Coalition wanted to send a message. Humans were weak, and weakness deserved punishment. They succeeded in sending a message, just not the one they intended. What they awakened wasn't the diplomatic species that had negotiated peace treaties for generations. What they unleashed was the ancient fury that had once conquered a homeworld through sheer, relentless brutality. The sleeping beast that had been carefully caged behind centuries of civilization. Humanity's response was swift and terrifying in its simplicity. No more civility. The galaxy was about to remember why Earth's history books were written in blood and why some species should never be pushed beyond their breaking point. Admiral Sarah Chun stood motionless in the command center of Earth's primary defense station, her dark eyes fixed on the massive holographic display before her. The images cycling through the projection made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to watch every second. Colony 7's final transmissions played on repeat. Families torn apart, children crying for parents who would never answer, homes burning while their occupants were systematically tortured for the entertainment of the Zethkar Coalition. The silence in the command center was deafening. 200 of humanity's finest military minds watched alongside their admiral, their faces growing harder with each passing moment. These were people who had dedicated their lives to protecting human colonies through diplomatic channels and careful military positioning. They had spent decades building relationships with alien species, establishing trade routes, and negotiating peaceful solutions to conflicts that could have escalated into wars. Captain Marcus Torres, Chin's second-in-command, finally broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the command center, it carried like thunder. Ma'am, the final death toll from Colony 7 has been confirmed. 43,000 civilians. No survivors. Chin nodded slowly, never taking her eyes off the display. The Zethkar had been thorough in their documentation. They had broadcast every moment of the massacre across 17 star systems, using humanity's own communication networks to ensure maximum exposure. They wanted the galaxy to see what happened when a species dared to oppose their expansion into the Outer Rim territories. Have the other coalition species responded to our diplomatic protests? Chin asked, though she already knew the answer from Torres' expression. Radio silence from all of them, Admiral. The Zeltharan Empire claims they were unaware of the Zethkar's intentions. The Makari Syndicate says it's an internal coalition matter. The Bravak Union won't even acknowledge our communications. Torres paused, his jaw clenching. They're all complicit, ma'am. Every single one of them. The coalition had grown bold over the past decade. What started as a trade alliance between 3 species had evolved into something far more sinister. A military partnership dedicated to carving up the galaxy's outer territories. Humanity's colonies had been thriving in those regions for over a century, building peaceful settlements and establishing mining operations that benefited not just humans, but dozens of other species through trade and technology sharing. But the coalition saw only resources to be claimed and populations to be controlled. They had started with subtle pressure, trade restrictions, navigation fee increases, demands for protection payments that were nothing more than extortion. When humanity had refused to abandon their colonies, the coalition had escalated to direct threats. Colony 7 had been their final warning. Chin finally, turned away from the display, her movement causing the entire command staff to straighten unconsciously. At 62, she had spent more than half her life in service to humanity's exploration and defense efforts. She had negotiated countless treaties, overseen the establishment of dozens of colonies, and built a reputation as one of the most diplomatic military leaders in human space. All of that was about to change. Captain Torres, I want you to send a message to every ship captain, every colony administrator, and every diplomatic station in human space. Tell them to prepare for a fundamental shift in humanity's approach to galactic relations. Chen's voice remained calm, but there was something new beneath the surface, something that made seasoned officers take an unconscious step backward. What should I tell them, Admiral? Chun walked to her private office at the rear of the command center, pausing at the threshold. When she spoke, her words carried across the entire room with crystal clarity. Tell them that 300 years of civility just ended. The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the command staff to process what they had just heard. For several long minutes, nobody moved or spoke. They had all known Admiral Chun for years, had served under her leadership through dozens of challenging situations. They had seen her negotiate with hostile alien species, manage resource crises that could have led to wars, and maintain humanity's reputation as a peaceful but strong presence in the galaxy. What they had just witnessed was something entirely different. Captain Torres was the first to recover, his training overriding his shock. He began issuing orders with mechanical precision, but his mind was racing. He had studied human military history extensively, and he understood the significance of what had just occurred. For centuries, humanity had chosen to be the civilized species in a galaxy full of predators. They had built their reputation on restraint, diplomacy, and careful, measured responses to aggression. But every human military officer learned about their species' past. Before they had reached the stars, humans had been something else entirely. They had been apex predators who had conquered their own homeworld through warfare that was both brutal and terrifyingly effective. The transition to a spacefaring civilization had required them to suppress those instincts, to build new cultural frameworks that emphasize cooperation over conquest. The massacre at Colony 7 had just torn down those frameworks. In her private office, Admiral Chun stood before a secured communication terminal, her hands hovering over the controls. She knew that the next few actions she took would fundamentally alter humanity's place in the galaxy. There would be no going back, no return to the careful diplomatic dance that had defined human relations with alien species for 3 centuries. She thought about the children of Colony 7, about families that would never be reunited, about 43,000 people who had died because humanity had been perceived as weak, as unwilling to defend their own. That perception was about to be corrected. Chun activated the communication terminal and began composing a message that would be sent to every human military installation, every colony defense force, and every diplomatic mission in known space. The words came easily, flowing from a part of her psyche that had been carefully controlled for decades. To all human forces, colonial administrations, and diplomatic missions, effective immediately, humanity is implementing Protocol Zero across all territories and installations. All diplomatic restraints are hereby suspended. All military engagement parameters are shifted to maximum effectiveness standards. All cultural exchange programs with coalition species are terminated. The Zethkar Coalition has demonstrated that they view human civility as weakness. They have chosen to target our civilians for entertainment and our colonies for resources. They have broadcast their atrocities to humiliate us before the galaxy. Their mistake was assuming that civility meant we had forgotten how to be something else. We try to be the galaxy's conscience. We try to be the voice of reason among species that respected only strength. We offered friendship to those who saw kindness as vulnerability. For 300 years, we have been the civilization that other species could aspire to become. That ends now. Humanity is returning to its roots. We will demonstrate why our ancestors conquered an entire planet before they had the wisdom to reach for the stars. The galaxy is about to learn what humans were before we chose to be civilized. And they're going to remember why some species should never be pushed beyond their breaking point. Authorization: Admiral Sarah Chun, Primary Defense Command. Classification: Priority Alpha. No review required. Distribution: all human forces, immediate implementation. Chun paused before sending the message, her finger hovering over the transmission key. Once this went out, there would be no stopping what came next. Humanity would transform from the galaxy's diplomatic species into something far more dangerous. She thought again about Colony 7, about the laughter of Zethkar soldiers as they tortured human families, about the calculated cruelty designed to break humanity's spirit. She pressed the key. Within hours, the message had reached every corner of human space. Colony administrators began implementing security protocols that hadn't been used since humanity's early expansion period. Military commanders started reviewing tactical doctrines that emphasized overwhelming force over surgical precision. Diplomatic missions began recalling personnel from coalition space. But the most significant changes were happening on Earth itself, in the deepest levels of the military complex, where humanity's most classified research and development projects were housed. Weapons systems that had been deemed too aggressive for human use were being reactivated. Combat doctrines that had been filed away as incompatible with current diplomatic policy were being updated and distributed. The Zethkar Coalition had wanted to send a message to humanity about strength and weakness. They had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Humanity was about to send a reply. On the bridge of the Coalition flagship destroyer of Hopes, War Commander Zethkar Valthos reviewed reports from the Colony 7 operation with satisfaction. The human settlements in Sector 7 had been completely eliminated, their resources claimed for the Coalition, and their population's final moments have been broadcast as a warning to any other species that might consider opposing Coalition expansion. The humans had responded exactly as predicted, with diplomatic protests, calls for galactic mediation, and expressions of moral outrage that meant nothing without the military force to back them up. Their reputation as the gentle giants of the galaxy remained intact, which meant they could be safely ignored while the Coalition continued its expansion into their territory. Valthos had studied human military capabilities extensively. They had impressive defensive technologies and well-trained personnel, but their tactics emphasized restraint and minimal casualties. Their entire military doctrine was built around the concept of proportional response, matching aggression level for level, always attempting to de-escalate conflicts rather than achieve decisive victory. It was exactly the kind of thinking that created victims rather than victors. The war commander was reviewing plans for the next phase of Coalition expansion when his communications officer approached with obvious confusion. "Sir, we're receiving some unusual reports from our intelligence assets in human space. Their military facilities are increasing security levels, and there appears to be significant movement of personnel and equipment." Valthos barely looked up from his planning displays. Typical human posturing. They want to look strong while they prepare to negotiate another surrender disguised as a peace treaty. "With respect, sir, this appears to be different. Our sources indicate they've implemented something called Protocol Zero. We don't have any intelligence on what that designation means." Now Valthos did look up, his four eyes focusing on the communications officer with interest. "Have you contacted our human diplomatic assets? They should be able to provide context for their government's response." "That's part of the problem, sir. All human diplomatic missions have gone silent. Our contacts within their trade delegations have stopped responding to communications. Even our intelligence assets embedded in their civilian populations have ceased reporting." For the first time since the Colony 7 operation, Valthos felt a small flicker of uncertainty. In his experience, species that were preparing to surrender increased their diplomatic communications, not decreased them. They sought dialogue, mediation, any possible avenue to avoid further conflict. Radio silence was the behavior of a species preparing for war. But that was impossible. Humans didn't make war. They made diplomatic protests and economic sanctions and careful surgical strikes that minimized casualties. They had spent centuries building a reputation as the galaxy's most civilized species. They had every advantage in terms of defensive technology and personnel training, but they had never demonstrated the willingness to use those advantages aggressively. Continue monitoring the situation, Valthos ordered. Alert me if their military movements escalate beyond normal defensive positioning. The communications officer saluted and returned to his station, but Valthos found himself staring at the tactical display with growing unease. Something was different about humanity's response to Colony 7, something that didn't match their historical behavioral patterns. He decided to accelerate the coalition's expansion timeline. Whatever the humans were planning, it would be better to present them with a series of accomplished facts rather than give them time to organize whatever response they thought they were capable of mounting. It was a decision he would later recognize as the moment when the Zethkar coalition signed its own death warrant. But that realization would come far too late to save his species from the consequences of awakening something that had been sleeping in the darkness between the stars, waiting for the right moment to remind the galaxy why humans had earned their place among the apex predators of the universe. The sleeping beast was awake, and it was very, very hungry. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came 12 hours after Admiral Chen's message reached the outer colonies. Captain Elena Vasquez had been preparing for another futile diplomatic mission to negotiate mining rights with the Bravac Union when her orders were suddenly and completely revised. Instead of traveling to the Bravac diplomatic station with a team of trade negotiators and cultural attaches, she found herself commanding a battle group of 15 ships moving toward the Kepler 442 system at maximum burn. Her previous mission parameters had emphasized compromise, mutual benefit, and long-term relationship building. Her new orders were a single sentence that made her hand shake as she read it. Secure all human assets in the Kepler 442 system by any means necessary. No prisoners. No negotiations. No merci. Vasquez had served in the Human Colonial Defense Force for 18 years. She had overseen countless diplomatic missions, supervised trade route establishments, and managed resource-sharing agreements with dozens of alien species. She was known throughout the outer colonies as someone who could find peaceful solutions to seemingly impossible conflicts. What she was being asked to do now was the complete opposite of everything she had been trained for. The Kepler 442 system contained 3 human mining colonies that had been established over the past 40 years. They were peaceful settlements, focused on extracting rare minerals that were then shared with other species through carefully negotiated trade agreements. The colonies had been prospering under human administration, providing employment for both human and alien workers while contributing to the galactic economy. 2 weeks ago, the Bravac Union had declared the entire system to be within their natural expansion zone and had demanded that all human operations be transferred to Bravac control. The human colony administrators had naturally refused, citing centuries of established precedent and galactic law regarding territorial claims. The Bravac response had been to begin a military buildup in neighboring systems while filing formal complaints with the Galactic Council about human aggression and territorial violations. It was a classic coalition tactic: manufacture a crisis, claim victim status, then use military force to seize what they wanted while portraying themselves as the injured party. Under normal circumstances, Vasquez would have been sent to negotiate a compromise solution. Shared administrative control, perhaps, or a long-term lease arrangement that allowed both species to benefit from the system's resources. It was the kind of diplomatic solution that had kept the peace for decades while allowing human colonies to continue functioning. But these were no longer normal circumstances. Vasquez's battle group dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system and immediately detected 17 Bravac warships positioned around the human colonies. The alien vessels were maintaining what they clearly considered a defensive formation, close enough to the colonies to intercept any supply ships but far enough away to claim they weren't technically conducting an invasion. It was a carefully calculated display of force designed to pressure the human colonies into surrendering without requiring the Bravac Union to officially declare war. Standard coalition tactics that had worked successfully against dozens of other species over the past decade. "Captain, we're receiving a communication from the lead Bravac vessel," reported Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Vasquez's communications officer. "They're demanding that we withdraw from Bravac space immediately." Vasquez studied the tactical display for several long moments. Under her previous rules of engagement, this would have been the point where she opened diplomatic channels, requested a meeting with the Bravac commander, and began the slow process of negotiating a face-saving solution for both sides. Instead, she found herself thinking about the children of Colony 7, about 43,000 humans who had died because humanity had been perceived as too civilized to fight back effectively. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, open a channel to all ships in the battle group. Include the Bravac vessels in the transmission range. Yes, ma'am. Channel open. Vasquez stood from her command chair, her voice carrying clearly across the bridge and out into space. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Human Colonial Defense Force. I am addressing all vessels currently in the Kepler 442 system. Effective immediately, this system is under human protection protocols. Any non-human military vessels have exactly 10 minutes to begin departure procedures. Any attempt to interfere with human colonial operations will be considered an act of war." The bridge fell silent. Vasquez's officers stared at their captain with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. In 18 years of service, none of them had ever heard a human military commander issue such a direct ultimatum to an alien force. "Captain," Hayes said carefully, "the Bravac commander is requesting clarification. He says there must be some mistake in our translation protocols." "No mistake, Lieutenant Commander. Begin countdown to weapons-free status. All ships in the battle group are authorized to engage hostile targets at T-minus 10 minutes if Bravac vessels have not begun departure procedures." What followed was the longest 10 minutes in recent galactic history. The Bravac commander, war leader Kethmos Brevtar, had commanded military operations for over 30 years. He had participated in dozens of coalition territorial acquisitions, always following the same successful pattern: make territorial claims, position military forces, wait for the target species to either surrender or request mediation, then negotiate a settlement that gave the coalition everything they wanted. Humans had always been the easiest targets because they invariably chose mediation over direct confrontation. Even when they had clear military superiority, humans preferred to find diplomatic solutions that avoided casualties on both sides. But something was different about this situation. The human captain's tone had been completely unlike anything in Brevtar's experience with their species. There had been no diplomatic language, no face-saving alternatives, no suggestion that negotiation was even possible. "War leader, should we request additional forces from the nearest coalition base?" asked his tactical officer. Brevtar considered the question. His 17 ships were more than sufficient to handle any normal human response. But Captain Vasquez's ultimatum suggested that normal rules might not apply to this encounter. "Negative. Begin calculating hyperspace jump coordinates for all vessels. If these humans want to play at being warriors, we'll withdraw and return with sufficient force to end their posturing permanently." It was a reasonable decision based on decades of experience with human military behavior. The coalition had learned that humans would use force defensively when directly threatened, but they had never demonstrated the willingness to pursue retreating enemies or escalate conflicts beyond the immediate tactical situation. Brevtar was about to discover that humanity's 300-year period of civilized restraint had officially ended. The Bravac vessels had begun their departure procedures when Captain Vasquez received a priority communication from Earth Command. She read the message twice before fully understanding what she was being ordered to do. "All ships belay previous orders. Target all Bravac vessels and prepare for full engagement. Authorization code Omega 77. Execute immediately. Lieutenant Commander Hayes turned from his station, his face pale. Captain, the Bravac ships are withdrawing. They're complying with our ultimatum. I understand that, Lieutenant Commander. But they came here to threaten human colonies. They positioned military forces around our settlements with the intention of forcing our people to abandon their homes. Vasquez's voice remained perfectly calm, but there was something in her tone that made her officers unconsciously step back from their stations. Ma'am, are you saying we should attack retreating vessels? I'm saying that the Bravac Union needs to understand that threatening human colonies has consequences. That positioning military forces around our settlements is an act of war, regardless of whether they follow through on their threats. Vasquez paused, watching the Bravac ships accelerating toward the hyperspace jump point. For 300 years, we've let species like the Bravac Union threaten our people, then withdraw when we showed up with sufficient force to defend ourselves. We've allowed them to view their aggressive actions as cost-free because we were too civilized to pursue consequences. She activated the ship-wide communication system. All hands, this is the captain. Today marks the end of humanity's policy of proportional response. The Bravac Union came here to steal human colonies through intimidation and military threats. They are learning that such actions have permanent consequences. All ships execute attack pattern Delta 7. Target engines and weapon systems first, then hull integrity. No survivors. What followed was less a battle than a systematic demonstration of why human military technology had always been designed with overwhelming capability that was simply never used to its full potential. The Bravac vessels, caught in the middle of departure procedures with their shields configured for hyperspace transition rather than combat, were completely unable to respond effectively. The engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it was over, 17 Bravac warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of superheated plasma, and the Kepler 442 system was firmly under human control. The destruction of the Bravac force sent shockwaves throughout coalition space that were felt within hours. For the first time in galactic history, humans had not only refused to negotiate with an aggressive alien force, but had completely destroyed that force even after it had begun retreating. War leader Kethmos Brevtar's final transmission had been received by Bravac Union command centers across 3 star systems. His last words were a warning that would prove prophetic. The humans have become something else. They're not the species we thought we knew. On Earth, Admiral Chun received Captain Vasquez's after-action report with grim satisfaction. The Kepler 442 engagement had been a perfect test case for humanity's new approach to galactic relations. A clear military victory with 0 human casualties and a message that would be understood throughout coalition space. But it was only the beginning. Captain Torres, what's the status on Operation Reckoning? Torres consulted his tactical display, where dozens of human battle groups were moving toward targets throughout coalition space. All task forces are in position, Admiral. We're ready to implement the next phase. Operation Reckoning was the culmination of 3 centuries of careful military planning that had never been intended for use. Human strategic analysts had always maintained detailed intelligence on potential threats throughout the galaxy, not because they planned aggressive action, but because they believed in being prepared for any possibility. The result was that humanity possessed complete tactical intelligence on every coalition military installation, supply depot, and command center within 100 light-years of human space. They knew the defensive capabilities, personnel numbers, and strategic value of every target. They had detailed plans for neutralizing coalition military power that had been updated continuously, but never implemented. Until now, Admiral, we're receiving priority communications from several neutral species requesting clarification on human intentions. The Altarian embassy is asking if we're declaring war on the entire coalition. Shin considered the question carefully. War implied a conflict between roughly equal opponents, a struggle where the outcome remained uncertain, and both sides would suffer significant casualties while pursuing their objectives. What humanity was about to unleash on the Coalition wasn't war. It was extermination. Tell the Altarians that humanity is implementing a correction to the galactic power structure. Species that have threatened human civilians or colonies will no longer be in a position to repeat those threats. Should I inform them that we're willing to negotiate? No. Negotiation implies that there's something to discuss. The Coalition species have demonstrated that they view human civility as weakness and human lives as expendable. We're going to correct both misconceptions permanently. Chun activated her command console and began reviewing the target list for Operation Reckoning. The Zethkar Coalition's primary fleet base at Zethmoran Prime. The Bravak Union's central command facility at New Bravakos. The Makari Syndicate's weapons manufacturing centers in the Rigel sector. Every military installation, every shipyard, every strategic resource center that allowed Coalition species to threaten other civilizations would be eliminated within the next 72 hours. Not captured, not neutralized, not bargained away in peace negotiations. Eliminated. Captain Torres, send the execute command to all task force commanders. Operation Reckoning is authorized for immediate implementation. All objectives are Priority 1. All targets are terminal. As Torres relayed the orders, Admiral Chun found herself thinking about the galaxy that would exist after Operation Reckoning was complete. It would be a fundamentally different place, one where humanity was no longer viewed as the civilized species that could be safely threatened or intimidated. The galaxy was about to learn what humans had been before they chose to be diplomatic. And every species that survived the lesson would remember why some civilizations should never be pushed beyond their breaking point. In the depths of space, 47 human task forces began accelerating toward their targets. Each force carried enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems, operated by personnel who had spent their entire careers learning to fight with careful restraint and measured response. They were about to discover what it felt like to fight without restrictions for the first time in 3 centuries. The Coalition species had wanted to test humanity's resolve. They were about to receive an answer that would echo through galactic history for the next 1,000 years. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the HCDF Retribution, humanity's most advanced warship, watching the planet Kethmorai Prime grow larger on the main display. The heavily fortified world served as the Coalition's emergency command center, where the surviving leadership of 3 species had gathered in a desperate attempt to coordinate their response to humanity's systematic campaign of military annihilation. It had been 6 days since Operation Reckoning began, and the Coalition's military capabilities had been reduced by nearly 80%. 17 major installations eliminated. Over 300 warships destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of military personnel who would never again threaten human civilians. But Chun understood that military victory alone would not be sufficient to achieve humanity's ultimate objective. The galaxy needed to witness the final act of this transformation, to see humanity deliver its definitive statement about the consequences of viewing human civility as weakness. Admiral, we're receiving multiple hails from Kethmorai Prime's orbital defense platforms, reported Captain Torres from his position at the communication station. They're requesting permission to negotiate a ceasefire. Chun studied the tactical display, where the planet's defensive systems were clearly visible. Kethmorai Prime was protected by the most sophisticated alien military technology the Coalition had been able to assemble: energy shields capable of withstanding planetary bombardment, orbital weapons platforms that could destroy entire fleets, and ground-based installations that had never been successfully assaulted by any known military force. Under humanity's previous engagement protocols, an attack on such a well-defended world would have been considered impossible without massive casualties and months of careful preparation. The very idea of directly assaulting the Coalition's most heavily fortified position would have been rejected as tactically unsound and diplomatically counterproductive. But Admiral Chun was no longer operating under humanity's previous engagement protocols. Captain Torres, Open a channel to all coalition forces in the HFY system. Include their leadership council in the transmission. Channel open, Admiral. Chun stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across space to every coalition vessel and installation in the system. This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Human Colonial Defense Force, addressing all coalition military forces and leadership personnel in the HFY system. 6 days ago, your species made a collective decision to test humanity's commitment to protecting our civilian populations. You massacred 43,000 innocent people at Colony 7, broadcasting their deaths as entertainment to demonstrate what you believed was human weakness. You have learned that your assessment was incorrect. The bridge of the retribution fell silent as Chun continued her address, her words being transmitted not only to coalition forces, but throughout human space and to neutral species monitoring the situation. Over the past 6 days, humanity has eliminated your major military installations, destroyed your fleets, and demonstrated why 3 centuries of diplomatic restraint should never have been mistaken for military incapability. Your species are no longer in a position to threaten human colonies or any other civilization that you previously considered vulnerable to your aggression. However, your leadership has requested negotiations for a ceasefire. I am here to provide my response to that request in person. On the surface of HFY Prime, the Coalition's Emergency Leadership Council watched Admiral Chen's address with growing horror. Supreme War Leader Kethmos Valtherin of the Zethkar, War Minister Brevgal Mokos of the Brevak Union, and Syndicate Director Malthuris Kane of the Makari had spent their entire careers believing that humans represented the galaxy's most predictable military opponent. They had built their expansion strategies around the certainty that humans would always choose negotiation over destruction, compromise over total victory. Even when humanity possessed clear military superiority, they had consistently demonstrated a preference for diplomatic solutions that allowed all parties to maintain some degree of dignity and autonomy. The systematic annihilation of coalition military power over the past 6 days had shattered those assumptions completely. Supreme War Leader, said Brevgal Mokos, his voice trembling with barely controlled panic, we must surrender immediately. The humans have capabilities we never suspected existed. They're not fighting like the species we thought we knew. Valtherin studied the tactical displays showing Admiral Chen's fleet in orbit around their world. 47 human warships, each one representing military technology that had been designed for total warfare, but never previously used to its full potential. War Minister Mokos, if we surrender now, what guarantee do we have that the humans will show mercy to our remaining populations? They have already demonstrated a willingness to eliminate entire military installations without regard for casualties. With respect, Supreme War Leader, what guarantee do we have that our populations will survive if we continue to resist? Look at what they did to Zethmoran Prime. Look at what they did to the Rigel sector installations. These humans are not the diplomatic species we thought we were fighting. Syndicate Director Kane activated the communication system linking the council chamber to Admiral Chen's fleet. Admiral Chen, this is the Coalition Emergency Leadership Council. We formally request immediate cessation of hostilities and the opening of diplomatic negotiations for a peaceful resolution to this conflict. Admiral Chen's response came within seconds, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who had already decided the fate of everyone listening. Coalition Leadership Council, there appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this situation. You believe that what has occurred over the past 6 days represents a military conflict between opposing forces. You are incorrect. What you have experienced is the systematic correction of a strategic miscalculation. Your species believed that human civility indicated human weakness. You believed that our diplomatic nature meant we lacked the capability or willingness to respond to aggression with overwhelming force. The elimination of your military capabilities over the past 6 days has corrected those misconceptions permanently. Chun paused, allowing her words to be fully understood by every person listening throughout the galaxy. There will be no negotiations. There will be no diplomatic compromise. There will be no face-saving agreement that allows your species to maintain the illusion that this situation represents anything other than your complete and total defeat. However, I am prepared to offer your population something that you did not offer to the people of Colony 7. I am prepared to offer them the opportunity to survive. The Coalition Leadership Council exchanged glances of desperate hope. Perhaps the humans retained enough of their diplomatic nature to accept some form of surrender that would preserve their civilizations. The terms for your species' continued existence are simple and non-negotiable, Chun continued. All remaining coalition military forces will be surrendered immediately. All military installations, shipyards, and weapons manufacturing facilities will be transferred to human administration. All government officials who participated in or supported the Colony 7 massacre will be turned over to human authority for judgment. Your species will exist under human oversight until such time as we are satisfied that you no longer represent a threat to any other civilization in the galaxy. This period of oversight will last no less than 200 years and may be extended indefinitely if your behavior indicates that you have not learned from this experience. You have 10 minutes to provide your unconditional acceptance of these terms. Any attempt to negotiate modifications will result in the immediate implementation of alternative solutions to the problem your species represent. The communication channel closed, leaving the Coalition Leadership Council to contemplate the complete destruction of everything they had worked to build over generations of military expansion. These are not terms of surrender, War Minister Mokos said quietly. These are terms of permanent subjugation. The alternative appears to be extinction, replied Syndicate Director Kane. Look at what they did to our military installations. Look at how thoroughly they dismantled our defensive capabilities. If they wanted to exterminate our populations, they clearly possess the ability to do so. Supreme War Leader Valderin found himself thinking about the human captain who had addressed him during the final moments of Zeth Moran Prime's existence. The man had spoken about humanity's transformation from a diplomatic species into something else, something that their actions at Colony 7 had awakened. I believe we have made a discovery that will reshape the galaxy's understanding of human nature, Valderin said finally. For 3 centuries, we assumed that their diplomatic behavior represented the full extent of their capabilities. We assumed that a species which chose negotiation over conquest simply lacked the ability to pursue total warfare effectively. But they possessed that ability all along. They were choosing to be diplomatic, choosing to be restrained, choosing to offer compromises instead of demanding surrender. They were not weak. They were showing mercy to species that they could have eliminated at any time. And we mistook that mercy for weakness. The 10-minute deadline expired with the coalition leadership's formal acceptance of Admiral Chen's terms. The surrender was unconditional, complete, and broadcast throughout the galaxy as humanity's definitive statement about the consequences of threatening human civilians. But the most significant moment came after the formal surrender, when Admiral Chen addressed not just the coalition species, but every civilization monitoring the situation throughout known space. To all species observing these events, humanity wishes to clarify our position regarding galactic affairs going forward. For 3 centuries, we have chosen to be the diplomatic species, the voice of reason, the civilization that sought peaceful solutions to conflicts that could have been resolved through superior military force. That choice was based on our belief that other species would recognize the value of civilization, that they would choose cooperation over conquest when presented with positive alternatives to warfare and domination. The massacre at Colony 7 demonstrated that our assumption was incorrect. Some species view civility as weakness and interpret mercy as an invitation to aggression. Chen's voice hardened, carrying implications that resonated throughout the galaxy. Let there be no confusion about humanity's capabilities or intentions. We possess the military technology and tactical expertise to eliminate any threat to our civilian populations. We have demonstrated our willingness to use that capability without restraint when our people are targeted for massacre. But we prefer to remain the galaxy's diplomatic species. We prefer to build trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and cooperative agreements that benefit all parties involved. We prefer to be the civilization that other species can work with rather than the one they fear. The choice of which version of humanity you encounter depends entirely on how you choose to treat human civilians and human colonies. Choose wisely. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy to process the implications of humanity's transformation. In the space of 6 days, humans had evolved from the diplomatic species that could be safely threatened to the apex predator that other civilizations would avoid provoking at all costs. But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated that this transformation was a choice rather than an inevitability. They had shown mercy to Zelthran civilians, offered survival to coalition populations, and made it clear that their preference remained peaceful coexistence rather than galactic domination. The galaxy now understood that humanity possessed the capability to eliminate any species that threatened them, but also retained the wisdom to choose restraint when dealing with civilizations that demonstrated respect for human life and human interests. 3 months later, Ambassador Elena Rodriguez stood before the Galactic Council, delivering humanity's first diplomatic address since Operation Reckoning had concluded. The galaxy had changed fundamentally during those 3 months, with dozens of species re-evaluating their relationships with both humanity and each other. The Human Colonial Defense Force wishes to announce the resumption of normal diplomatic relations with all species that demonstrate respect for human territorial integrity and civilian populations, Rodriguez announced. We remain committed to the principles of cooperation, mutual benefit, and peaceful resolution of conflicts that have guided our interspecies relationships for 3 centuries. However, we wish to clarify that our diplomatic approach is now supported by military capabilities that we are prepared to use without hesitation against any species that targets human civilians for violence or intimidation. We try to be the galaxy's conscience. We were ignored by species that viewed our civility as weakness. So we demonstrated what we are when we choose to be something else. Now we offer the galaxy a choice. Work with the diplomatic species that we prefer to be, or face the military force that we are capable of becoming. Rodriguez paused, looking directly at representatives from the dozens of species that had watched humanity transform from diplomatic giant to apex predator in less than a week. We hope that choice will be an easy one for civilizations that value peace, cooperation, and the protection of innocent life. But for any species still considering whether human civilians represent acceptable targets for violence or intimidation, please remember what happened to the coalition species who made that mistake. Remember Colony 7. Remember Operation Reckoning. Remember that humanity tried diplomacy first. And remember that some sleeping giants should never be awakened. The galaxy remembered. For the next 1,000 years, no species would make the mistake of viewing human civility as weakness or human colonies as acceptable targets for aggression. Humanity had chosen to be diplomatic again. But now everyone understood that it was a choice, not a limitation. And that made all the difference in the galaxy's new order, where the gentle giants had revealed the apex predators they had always carried within themselves, carefully controlled but never eliminated. The dark oath had been fulfilled. Civility had ended, served its purpose, and been carefully restored. But the galaxy would never forget what lay beneath it, waiting patiently for the next species foolish enough to test humanity's resolve. The beast was sleeping again, but it was a very light sleep.